Welcome to Dey Weekly. I'm your host, Tim Lyons from Running Through the Jungle. I'll provide a quick recap from Week 6 from the Cincinnati Bengals game. And for all you fantasy football enthusiasts, I'll also cover the top 5 fantasy point getters from this week. Now, I'm going to do a little bit something different because we got some news today that Davante Adams from the Raiders was traded to the New York Jets, Jets, Jets. And then Amari Cooper was traded to the Buffalo Bills from the Cleveland Browns today. Now, to the Cincinnati Bengals game versus the New York Giants. The Cincinnati Bengals narrowly defeated the New York Giants with a score of 17-7 in their Week 6 matchup. Joe Burrow scored a career-long 47-yard run in the first quarter. He was scooting 20 miles per hour almost, 19.8 to be exact. Chase Brown added a 30-yard touchdown in the fourth quarter. The Bengals defense stepped up with B.J. Hill making a significant impact with 2 pass deflections and 2 quarterback hits. And the Giants, Daniel Jones was intercepted by Jermaine Pratt in the first quarter. The game was a defensive struggle with both teams combining for 10 punts and 2 missed field goals. It wasn't the prettiest game, but the Bengals managed to grind out a win to improve their record. Now, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. You can also check us out on YouTube and listen to on all your favorite podcast platforms weekly. Check out Running Through the Jungle's Wednesday show on YouTube, and then you can catch it on the next morning on your drive home or drive to, I don't know, on your Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast from. And then you can hear our roaring reactions after the game. It depends on when it is. If it's on a Sunday, might be before the night game, or if it's on a Monday, you'll catch us the day after. Now, I'm going to take a quick commercial break, and I'll be right back with you. Welcome back to Dey Weekly. Again, I'm your host, Tim Lyons, and I'm going to go over the top 5 point getters for the week. Your number 1 scorer for the week was Chris Godwin for Tampa Bay versus New Orleans Saints. He had 35.50 points, but I'll get into more of that stats when we get to the wide receivers. Now for number 1, for the quarterbacks, Caleb Williams, Chicago versus Jacksonville, had 226 yards passing, 4 touchdowns, 1 interception, and 56 yards rushing for a total of 28.64 points. Baker Mayfield came in at number 2 versus New Orleans. He had 325 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, 29-yard rushing, and he had 25.90 points. Jordan Love at number 3 versus Arizona had 258 points, 4 touchdowns, 1 interception, ran for 13 yards, and had 25.62 points. At number 4, Jared Goff versus Dallas had 315 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, ran for 5 yards, totaling 25.10 points. Then at number 5, Josh Allen versus the New York Jets had 215 yards passing, 2 touchdowns. It ran for 18 yards and 1 touchdown for 24.40 points. Then at running back, you had number 1, Sean Tucker for Tampa Bay versus New Orleans, had 136 yards rushing, 1 touchdown. He had 3 receptions for 56 yards and a touchdown for 34.20 points. Joe Mixon versus New England had 102 rushing yards, 1 touchdown, 2 receptions for 30 yards and a touchdown, and he had 27.20 points. At number 3, Bijan Robinson versus Carolina had 95 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns. He had 3 receptions for 10 yards for 25.50 points. At number 4, the King Henry, Derrick Henry versus Washington had 132 yards rushing, 2 touchdowns for 25.20 points. At number 5, Tyrone Tracy Jr. versus Cincinnati had 50 rushing yards and 1 touchdown, 6 receptions for 57 yards, totaling 22.70 points. Now to the wide receivers. Chris Godwin versus New Orleans had 11 receptions, 125 yards, 2 touchdowns. And again, like I said, he led the the fantasy point getters for the week with 25.50 points. Garrett Wilson versus Buffalo at number 2 had 8 receptions, 170 yards, and 1 touchdown, totaling 24.70 points. A.J. Brown versus Cleveland had 6 receptions, 116 yards, and 1 touchdown for 23.60 points. Alan Lazard versus Buffalo had 6 receptions, 114 yards, 1 touchdown for 23.40 points. And Scary Terry McLaurin versus Baltimore had 6 receptions, 53 yards receiving, and 2 touchdowns for 23.30 points. And to the tight ends, Cole Kmet versus Jacksonville had 5 receptions, 70 yards, 2 touchdowns for 24 points. George Kittle versus Seattle at number 2 had 5 receptions, 58 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 22.80 fantasy points. Evan Ingram versus Chicago had 10 receptions, 110 yards, and he lost a fumble. He got 18.20 points. Terry McBride versus Green Bay had 8 receptions, 96 yards receiving for 17.60 points. And at number 5, Brock Bowers, the rookie out of Las Vegas versus Pittsburgh, had 9 receptions, 71 yards for 16.10 points. Now to the kickers. Jake Bates versus Dallas had 5 PATs. He had 4 field goals made for 17 points. Chris Boswell versus the Las Vegas Raiders had 2 PATs, and he made 4 field goals, 1 for 50-plus yards for 16 points. Austin Seibert at number 3 versus Baltimore had 2 PATs and 3 field goals, 1 50-plus yarder for 13 points. Young Ho Koo versus Carolina had 3 PATs, and he made 3 field goals for 12 points. Justin Tucker versus Washington had 3 PATs and 3 field goals for 12 points. Now to the defense. Detroit Lions at number 1 versus Dallas, 4 sacks, 3 INTs, 2 fumble recoveries, only allowed 9 points only allowed 9 points and had 18 fantasy points. At number 2, Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus New Orleans had 5 sacks, 2 interceptions, 1 fumble, 1 touchdown, allowed 27 points, and scored 17 fantasy points. At number 3, Houston Texans versus versus New England had 4 sacks, 2 interceptions, 2 fumble recoveries, allowed 21 points for 12 points. Pittsburgh Steelers versus Las Vegas had 1 sack, 1 interception, 2 fumble recoveries, allowed 13 points for 11 fantasy points. Green Bay versus Arizona comes in at number 5, had 3 fumble recoveries, allowed 13 points, and had 10 fantasy points. Now, to the not-so-perfect lineup, Dak Prescott had 3.22 points. Zach Moss had 0.5 points for Cincinnati. Tank Bigsby had 2.4 points for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Calvin Ridley only had 0.9 points for Tennessee Titans. I forgot he went to the Titans. Mike Evans had only 5.4 points for Tampa Bay. Conklin only had 3 points for the tight ends for the New York Jets. Brandon Ayuk, if you put him at a flex position, only had 5.7 points. Evan McPherson, our own kicker, had only 5 points. And the defense for the Cowboys had negative 1 point. More of the story is, if you had that lineup, you didn't have a good week and you probably lost your fantasy. Now, thank you so much for joining. I'm your boy again, Tim Lyons from Running Through the Jungle. I hope you guys enjoyed my content. Please like, subscribe, share with a friend. Make sure you give us a 5-star review on our podcast. And I'll see you guys again next week. Have a great day. Hoo day.